Okay, so I'll start by saying hello to everyone. I know some of you attended previous seminars, but for those of you who are attending for the first time, my name is Brídín Carroll, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Irish Centre of Social Gerontology, so ICSG, at NUI Galway, and I'm the organiser of this seminar series with the support of ICSG. So if you did miss either of the previous seminars, they were recorded, and these recordings are available on the ICSG website, which is the same webpage where you would have found all the information about the seminar and the links to register. And also any resources that the previous speakers shared, so things like their papers or any of their slides, they're also linked there. So on to today. So thanks everyone for joining us. This is the third of 4 online seminars on the topic of emotionally traumatic or emotionally demanding research. So the goal of the seminar series is to increase learning about research in which emotionally demanding or traumatic topics are encountered. And this has been with the objective of making researchers better equipped to deal with these topics for their own and for research participants' psychological safety. So for those of us in NUI Galway, this seminar series builds on a reading group which we ran in the last months of 2020 on the same topic. So the papers we examined highlighted a number of institutional challenges and methodological challenges of conducting this type of research. So just some examples of things that came up in these papers. One was the institutional silencing of these challenges. Another was a particular challenge in one paper talked about a challenge of conducting research with perpetrators of trauma. And another example from a very recent paper were very much to do with the specifics around COVID-19 and the challenges of showing empathy when conducting research amid COVID-19 restrictions. So, for people who are doing interviews over the phone, say, for example. But these readings also highlighted some opportunities or specific strategies. So for example, one talked about the use of self-reflexive meta-analysis within one's research to assess and improve the process on an ongoing basis. Another example was that researchers could harness their own insider status as someone with personal experiences of the same trauma. So obviously there's two sides to this coin, in that if you had suffered the same trauma that the person you're interviewing or in a focus group had suffered from, there's a risk of being re-traumatized yourself, but then there's also this idea of becoming empowered or kind of harnessing your own insider status. And a third example is the potentially transformative justice doing process of witnessing and recognizing participants' experiences. So again, there's two sides to this, in that by asking someone to tell their story of trauma, you're risking them becoming re-traumatized, but then there's also this potential benefit of bearing witness to their to this trauma and then somehow feeling empowered following this. So if you're interested in the papers we read and others, they're available in a document under the extra materials heading on the webpage for this seminar on the ICSG website. So if you just go to icsg.ie, click on news and then click on the page for the seminar series, you can get that there. So the seminars are being designed to hear as wide a variety of knowledge and experiences as possible. So in each seminar, we hear from an established academic researcher who's experienced in this type of research and who has reflected at least once on this kind of methodological challenge in a publication. And in each seminar, we also hear the perspective of a different type of actor in the process. So in the first seminar, we benefited from the perspective of an early career researcher. So we had a PhD student. In the second seminar, we heard from someone who acts as a gatekeeper to an often traumatized population of people. So this person worked for a human rights organization. In this seminar, we'll have a talk from the head of student counselling at NUI Galway to gain some insight into how research students can be affected by trauma in their work and maybe some strategies around this. And in the final seminar, which is in 3 weeks' time, we'll play host to 2 experienced transcribers. And transcribers are an often forgotten cohort in the process of conducting research, which is emotionally traumatic. So I'll hand over now to our speakers, but just first to let you know, each speaker is going to speak for 20 minutes and then they'll have up to 20 minutes for questions. So we're going to just have a Q&A format, which seems to work best, rather than an open discussion, because we tend to have big numbers. So if you do have a question, just put it in the chat box and then I'll put it to the speaker. But if you really feel the need to add something, you can just raise your hand virtually on camera and I can call on you and unmute you. And similar to previous seminars, today's seminar is being recorded and it's going to be uploaded to the ICSG website afterwards for viewing. So I'll hand over now to our first speaker, who is Dr. Sian Oram. So Dr. Oram is head of the section of Women's Mental Health and Senior Lecturer in Women's Mental Health at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London. She's also co-director of the UKRI Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network. And I should say that at the the VAMHN, the Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network, are hosting their 4th annual network meeting next Monday, the 8th of March from 1:30 to 3:30. And I believe to find out more, you can go to vamhn.co.uk. So Dr. Oram's research focuses on interpersonal trauma, its intersection with gender and with institutional and societal structures, and its relationship to mental health. She has an interest in developing methods for safe, ethical and participatory research with and by people affected by trauma and abuse, and has expertise in qualitative methods, systematic reviews and evaluation research. Okay, so Sian, I'll hand over to you now if you're ready.
Thank you for the invitation and for that really nice introduction. It's really nice to be with a group of people who share this interest. So as you say, I'm based at King's College London in the UK, and my experience of conducting traumatic research has included research with survivors of human trafficking and modern slavery, and with survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And really what I want to talk about over the next, it might be 20 minutes, I haven't timed it, so we'll see how far I go, is anticipating and trying to mitigate the impacts of traumatic research and what I've done in my own practice. So I hope that isn't repeating what has come previously. Unfortunately, I haven't attended the previous seminars, but hopefully learning from other people's practice is useful. So I suppose the first thing that I'd like to highlight really is that, as Breeden, you said, that really all members of a research team can be exposed to trauma. And this is working across a range of methodologies and across multiple stages of the research process. And I think too often when we're considering what is traumatic research, we're thinking about interviewing participants about their experiences and about analysing qualitative data, so about the experiences of the impacts of reading and rereading transcripts and of that immersion in what can be very difficult material. But exposure is happening at multiple other points too. So if we're working with an interpreter, for example, and that's something I do very frequently in my research with survivors of human trafficking, we're potentially exposing that person to trauma. And I often wonder how it feels to re-speak someone's trauma in the first person during the process of interpretation. And I'm not aware of any research on that. I'd love to do some research on that in the future, because I think that re-speaking is a particular nuance that is worth exploring. As you mentioned, if we're outsourcing our transcription, we're exposing the transcriber. It's there during data entry, it's there during the screening and the review and the rereading of papers in a literature review. I think that potential exposure to people doing a systematic review often isn't thought about. You think, oh, it's just a systematic review. But actually, if you're reading 120 papers about a form of violence and abuse, that is potentially quite traumatizing. It's there in the review of case files, it's there in the analysis of quantitative as well as qualitative data. I think this, anonymizing experience, this process of reducing experience to numbers does something also to how we feel about a problem. Some people may find it easier to deal with, but I think some people actually find that also very difficult. The second thing I guess I want to highlight is the unpredictability of how potentially traumatic material touches us. So a single detail, a characteristic, a phrase can catch us in a way that we didn't and perhaps couldn't expect, or an interview can turn out to feel unexpectedly personal. So I don't have lived experience of any of the topics that I research. Many of my colleagues, past and present, do, but that doesn't mean that interviews don't feel personal to me in some way. So I remember being absolutely floored by an interview with a survivor of human trafficking who was very similar in age and build of my dad and had some of the same mannerisms, and I just couldn't get it out of my head, because it finally made sense to me that this can happen to anybody, that all of these people that I had been speaking to really were somebody's mother, somebody's father, somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, and suddenly that was made real to me in a way that it hadn't been before. And that was very hard for me. Or it can be the accumulation of experiences, so each unique, but with so many shared characteristics, so that the inhumanity and the unfairness can just all of a sudden seem too much. So what I've really concluded is that it is vitally important to plan for the impact of traumatic research. And that sounds so incredibly basic, but we know that it just isn't done. Within my research group, the section of women's mental health, we've recently co-created a set of 10 principles that describe how we work. And among these, and one of the most dear to me, is that we understand the impact of our work on ourselves and our colleagues, and we acknowledge that many of our colleagues have their own lived experience of the topics that we study, and we're clear about and respect our boundaries and limits, and we take steps to support our own mental well-being. And I think that feels so foundational to the work that we do. And there's personal responsibility here, of course, on the part of the researchers. Everybody has to sign up to these principles and live them in the best way that they can, but there are also relational responsibilities to each other as colleagues, and there are also institutional responsibilities that need to be fulfilled for this principle to be realised. So I wanted to talk through some of the things that we do, and I'd be really glad to learn about other people's practice, because I don't think that we have all of the answers by any means. What we have done is develop in fits and starts kind of our own internal good practice, and it's very striking to me. I'd be delighted to, of course. We are, there isn't a single document setting out good practice that I can find, and I think that really badly needs to exist. It needs to be written by multiple people in collaboration, sharing their experiences. But these are some of the things that we've done. So at a very basic level, we ensure that on top of regular meetings with line managers or supervisors, field researchers have a buddy with whom they check in with before and after completing a survey or a qualitative interview. And that's of course important for physical safety. It's part of a lone working protocol, but we make very explicit that this is also an opportunity to speak with a colleague about how things went and the feelings that it left you with. So it's not just sending a text message to say, all done, on my way home. It's an actual conversation. And if you don't want to talk about how the interview went, you just want to kind of shoot the breeze for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, that's fine. But having that interaction with one of your colleagues at the end of a data collection point is important. And we think that's as important when you're doing remote data collection as it is when doing data collection in person. And again, that's really reiterating that this isn't about physical safety alone, it's also about emotional well-being. We ask field researchers not to schedule data collection at the very end of a day or on a Friday afternoon. So again, really basic, and again, relevant to the well-being of both the participant and the researcher. We don't want to finish a day or a week with an encounter that is potentially traumatizing and to be left unsupported. And if it's necessary to refer a person on for further support or to speak with their caseworker or a GP, that's of course more straightforward to do that within office hours. And similarly, I encourage researchers who are conducting data analysis or reviewing lots of articles on potentially traumatizing topics not to be doing this at the end of the day. So I suggest to people, leave off that at 3 o'clock and do something else with the last 2 hours of your day. We are very proactive in discussing potential strategies for maintaining, or in some cases creating, a boundary between ourselves and our research. And these strategies necessarily vary between members of the team. So some people will go for a run, I always take a shower, some people call a friend, some people write in a journal. And I think the only important thing is that it's intentional, and that we recognize it as part of our work. This is just part of our practice. It's what we do. It's not leisure. It's not indulgence. Also supporting the principle of recognising the impacts of our work and respecting our boundaries and limits is the provision of group reflective supervision. So this is independently facilitated by a clinical psychologist, and this is available to all members of staff and students within the section of women's mental health. So this group's gone through various incarnations. Originally, it was held on a fairly ad hoc and project-specific basis, starting with the project that I worked on as a junior researcher, in which me and a small number of colleagues interviewed over 150 survivors of human trafficking. But what became apparent over time was that section members were encountering potentially distressing material in projects that weren't ostensibly about experiences of violence and abuse. It was coming up elsewhere in projects, for example, about researching women's experiences of perinatal mental health problems. Even though we didn't ask about these experiences, they were coming up because they were relevant to women's experiences. And this comes back to my point about unpredictability. I think as well as there being unpredictability about how we will react to potentially traumatizing material, there's unpredictability about when and how we'll encounter it. And so the group is now available to all of our staff and students. So the group is optional. We find that membership changes over time as projects progress, as needs change, as members join or leave the research group. But we find that for the time that it is used, it is valuable. And also that there's a sense of security that comes from its being available, even if an individual chooses not to use it. I'm aware of, from speaking with other colleagues, that our group is relatively unusual in making this provision for our team. And I believe that principal investigators and institutions need to provide greater support and to be thinking about making this type of provision for researchers who are conducting potentially traumatizing research. So it takes effort and it takes money. It's, you know, we're in the process of transitioning between facilitators at the moment, and it's taken me 2.5 months to, I'm about at the point of finding a new person, but you know, it's been quite an undertaking. We've sometimes managed to find facilitators who'll work with us for free, but this isn't always the case. And where we pay for these sessions, we're typically paying about £100 to £150 a month, and we have to plan for this within our research group finances. And I'd like to see these costs being built into grant applications, into fellowship applications, but I'd also like to see recognition at the level of institutions that these needs exist and that these funds need to be made available for research groups to apply into internally on a needs-led basis. As you mentioned at the start, Bridine, I'd also like to see explicit recognition of the risks to researcher emotional well-being as well as physical safety within the risk assessment forms that we're required to undertake for every project, with the expectation that the principal investigator can set out how they're going to discuss these risks with their team and how they're going to work to mitigate them. And I'd like to see research ethics committees including within their remit what steps are being taken to ensure the safety of researchers as well as participants. I can see that we're very, very much attuned with these desires, Bridine, from what you said in your introduction. So you asked me to think about some of the structural and institutional challenges to this, and I have to say that I don't know what the answer is. I think part of the problem is that it's not necessarily on the radar of senior management. I think it's basic as that. I don't think it's anything malevolent. I think it's just, this isn't the type of research that senior management have come up through the ranks doing. It's very much the case that, you know, despite the high prevalence of domestic and sexual abuse and other forms of trauma in society, societal and political and economic responses are shamefully inadequate, and it's not prioritised. And so the research that we do isn't prioritised by people who are outside of our field. And I think, therefore, how we do our research hasn't been prioritised either. So, like any good researcher, I think it's important to document and evidence our experiences. I've been glad to see peer-reviewed papers describing secondary traumatisation around conducting this type of research, and I'm aware of at least one PhD project that's exploring this issue, but much more is needed from the perspectives of researchers with different experiences and backgrounds and subjects. And I think all of us need to be working within the structures and channels available to push for recognition and resources, crucially. How long have I got left, Bridine?
You are 14 minutes in, so.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
I will keep going. So back to the here and now rather than my kind of rantings about the unfairness of the system, and our group session. So what we do in these groups varies, and I should say that I don't attend these groups myself anymore because I want to provide a space for the members of my team to speak freely without feeling inhibited by my being there. It's meant to be an independent and separate space. Over the past year, the group has been relatively unstructured. A recurrent theme has been managing the stress caused by COVID-19 and of working remotely. And that's been a particular challenge for us actually, because although we've always been very flexible about people working from home, we have really encouraged people not to work from home on material that is potentially distressing and traumatizing. And for many of our junior researchers, they're working in shared houses. Their bedroom has also become their office, and maintaining that separation between work and study is something we've had to really think very carefully about and develop new strategies for managing. So we've had a lot of kind of focus on COVID over the last year, but previously we've worked in ways so groups have identified several topics they want to discuss over several sessions, and they've combined that more kind of intentional working with a period of unstructured discussion. So, I mean, when I started as a researcher, I think the emotions that came up most frequently for me were anger and sadness, just anger at the way in which people are made to suffer by others and by systems, and anger at my own helplessness because I couldn't intervene to change people's circumstances. And because I most often conducted single interviews with participants, I had no way of knowing what happened next. And I found that incredibly difficult. Did their situations improve? Did they regain custody of their children? Were they deported? Were their abusers jailed? And we'd often end an interview by asking the participant about their hopes for the future in an attempt to move their focus from the difficulties of the past and present. But what happened to people and their hopes and their dreams? Obviously, we had no way of knowing that. And of course, I still sometimes feel those things because realistically, I can't give any assurances that participating in a research project will benefit an individual in any material way. And typically my onwards contact with the participant will be limited to sharing a copy of the research findings with them. And even this is very challenging for survivors of trafficking because they're subject to frequent relocation by the government, and maintaining contact is difficult. But I think where I've come to is to see research that through doing research, I'm able to bear witness to people's experiences, and I can refuse to be a bystander to their suffering. And I think to do this well, to bear witness well, and I think doing it well is important for researcher well-being as well as participant well-being, which is why I want to speak about it briefly, is that we need to be doing research that is trauma-informed and is survivor-informed. And this is a very large discussion and one that I don't really have time to go into detail about. So if you haven't been signposted previously to the Survivors' Voices Charter for engaging survivors in research and practice, I'd recommend you do so, and I can pop the link into the chat. So the key aim is really to enable survivors to turn pain into power. And the basic premise is that in order to do so, interactions must be the opposite of abuse. So they have to amplify rather than silence voices. They have to be safe, they have to be empowering, they have to be accountable, they have to be transparent. So please do download the charter and reflect on what it might mean for your research. But I think also we can turn the principles to our own practice and think about what does this mean for me as a researcher also. But I just want to, I know we have a nice amount of time for questions, so I just want to end by saying a few words about the Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network, if you don't mind, which I co-direct, because I think connecting with other researchers is extremely helpful, of course, for our personal and professional development, but also for our well-being. So this is a network of now more than 900 researchers, practitioners and survivors, and I recognise that those categories are by no way mutually exclusive. We host a variety of events and meetings, as Bridine said. Our next one is on the 8th of March. You can sign up on Eventbrite, and we'll be announcing a webinar series soon on the theme of prevention and intervention that you'll be able to book onto. We also have a heavy focus on early career research capacity building. So we run grant writing workshops to support our researchers to develop grant and fellowship applications. We have a twice yearly bursary competition to support researchers attending training and conferences on the topics of violence, abuse and mental health. and we're currently running a seminar series aimed at ECRs on topics such as working with policymakers, juggling commitments, and writing grant applications. We've also got a monthly newsletter, and that's just a mine of information about recent research and resources, as well as funding and collaboration opportunity. So it's a free network. I'll pop the address to sign up in the chat box, and I will leave it there. Thank you.
That's great, Sian. That was perfect. Just under 20 minutes, so bang on time. Okay, so if anyone has any questions for Sian, please put them in the chat box. Grazina asked, could you please share the principles? So I saw that early on. Yeah, so did you say this is an actual document and a written document of principles?
So this is, at the moment, this is an internal document that we have developed with our group, but our intention is to put it on our website. So when we do that, what I'll do is send that through to you, Bridine, and then I would be happy for that to be shared.
Great, yeah.
So it doesn't solely focus on working on traumatizing research, but that's one of the key principles in which we do work.
Brilliant. And when that's shared, I can put that onto the webpage for the seminar series. So that I'm kind of seeing the webpage for the seminar series as being, you know, kind of a one-stop shop for as many resources that I can find on this topic. So while we wait for other people to put up some questions, I wanted to ask Sian, I thought it was really interesting. So a lot of what you said, as you said, you know, I've thought about already, but one thing I hadn't really thought about was, well, obviously we both kind of came to the conclusion that there isn't enough institutional leadership on this, you know, from the top down. But you were saying you were quite charitable when you said that it wasn't out of, you know, kind of badness. It's more just that it's not on their radar. And you were saying it's because it's not because of the type of research they've ever done. And it brought me back to when I worked in the University of Birmingham, and there was talk of the, you know, the presidents of the university and the deans and the vice deans, and how there was a prevalence of older white men, and particularly men from hard science backgrounds. So you don't tend, and you can see that now, you don't tend to get people in these very senior leadership roles from the humanities, from the arts and sciences. I know that's starting to change now, but do you think that's part of it? That if these people haven't gone through the type of research that we're going through, like you said, it's just not on their radar. It's just... Yeah,
I think that's absolutely the case. I think if you've never experienced it, then, you know, I think it happens to you all the time, that you have a life experience and you think, oh, that would have made my life so much easier if I had that. And all of these times I've missed the opportunity to make life easier for somebody else. And it just because it didn't occur to me, because it wasn't part of my, it just wasn't on my radar. And so I'm a massive fan of Caroline Criado Perez and her work on the gender data gap. And, you know, she's very much in the case that, you know, people just don't think to measure this. And so people just don't see it. And so nothing ever gets done about it. And I think it is that, you know, people are, you know, if you've come up doing lab work, then you're not going to be thinking about, you know, what does it feel like to sit and read about somebody's experiences of trauma. If you're, you know, if you are, you know, very focused on medical sciences and, you know, and your life is diabetes and asthma, you know, a high proportion of the people who you'll be seeing day to day will be experiencing domestic and sexual violence, but you probably have never asked them about it. And so it just doesn't, I feel like, you know, I spent a lot of my early career kind of people saying, oh, you do women's mental health, oh, that's interesting, that's niche, or you do domestic violence, oh, that's quite particular, isn't it? And I'm like, no, it really isn't. It's very, very fundamental, but it's just not there. And so I think you need to, you know, a lot of what I spend, spend a lot of time now kind of trying to get questions about domestic and sexual violence integrated into health surveys, into psychiatric morbidity surveys, into lots, you know, into being a variable that's measured in trials to see whether it moderates treatment effect, because I think we have to start moving it into other fields. We have to make it visible in more areas of academia.
Okay, there's still no questions, so I'll just keep going because I have a question. And I think still on the kind of the issue of kind of the top-down leadership or the lack of it. So again, we both agree on the need for the embedding of these requirements around, you know, emotional well-being into ethical approval applications. Is it a chicken and egg thing? I wonder if it gets embedded into the ethical approval applications, will that force those in power to provide the type of resources? You know, you talk about the kind of lack of resources, or the inconsistency of resources for facilitators for your group. So do you think that if it becomes a fundamental part of ethical approval applications, that then that will force the hand of those in power to make provisions or to provide resources?
I mean, I think it would certainly encourage principal investigators to include requests for funding for those things, and to build them into study protocols. I mean, I think you have to make it difficult for people not to do it. Is my sense of doing that. You know, when the head of NIHR, which is one of our major research funders that in my institution relies on, about 5, maybe slightly longer than, maybe about 8 years ago now, they said that if you don't get at least a silver award on this independent gender equality framework, you're not entitled to come to us to request capital funding anymore. And that was a big problem. You know, suddenly institutions who relied on NIHR funding were extremely interested in making sure that they met these gender equality standards, because there was something in it for them. And I think, you know, similarly, I'd love to see a funder saying that, you know, we want you to make your, you know, you have to show to us that you're safeguarding your researchers, otherwise your grant is ineligible. I'd love to see that. But similarly, you know, I'd like to be able to, you know, research ethics committee saying, if you can't safeguard your researchers, you know, this is a basic employment issue. You can't safeguard your researchers. You can't do this research. There's your incentive. So yeah, I think you have to do it.
Yeah. And on that, I think as well, I'm trying to prepare a document to kind of put forward, and I'm going to try and direct it towards like the HR department and things like that, and the welfare officer for students, because, you know, this is something about, you know, the basic protection of people that the universities have responsibility for. Alice Tufts has a question.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Mine's comes from a personal experience. I'm doing a research with Imperial War Museums and on the Holocaust, and it's like affected my mental health. And I've been trying to advocate for students who are researching difficult subjects, and I think there's a real been trying to advocate and get more support for students, and then more, like, open conversations about how this might affect and impact students. And there's been a bit of a pushback and a kind of unwillingness to keep bringing it up as a kind of a warn, not as a, that they kind of feel that if they're gonna talk about it, it might make people scared that this is an issue. But I'm just wondering, I kind of had a big effort to do it, and it kind of wore me down, and I'm kind of like, well, I'm trying to look after my mental health too, but then trying to advocate, and how much pushing can I do? And I guess I was just wondering if you've got any advice on kind of tackling a big thing, but then looking after yourself, and like how, or like if you've got any advice for next steps, where I can go now.
I think that's really hard, Alice. I'm really sorry that that's been your experience. And it's quite difficult to give advice without knowing more. And I'd be really happy to have a chat offline and try and brainstorm that with you. I mean, I think that's a really counterproductive thing that you've been told, that, you know, that talking about this will put people off or make it hard for people. I always think that, you know, it's, you don't remind people that things are difficult by having a conversation about it. It just, you know, things are just difficult, and you need to be open about that. Are you doing a PhD at the moment, or are you doing a
PhD? You're
doing a PhD. And is it something that you've discussed with your supervisor?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'm conscious that this is being reported and this is going to be made available online, and maybe it's not best for you to have that conversation with me now. But I mean, I guess I would probably start with, going through those type of structures with my supervisor, with my head of graduate studies. I think it's difficult when you feel a responsibility to try and improve things for other people. And you do need to look after yourself within that, and think about trying to separate what would help you. And what the change you would like to see would be, and whether this is the kind of the best time for you to be pushing for this.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Alice. And we have a question from Arlene Crampsey. She says, I think this is really important. It strikes me that the only way to get our institutions to take these into account is to ensure funding bodies make them requirements. I suppose the question is, how do these conversations make it to the funders' tables?
Yeah, I think it's something that I think it's really tricky. I think oftentimes it's kind of taking opportunities where they present themselves. So, for example, I noticed that there was one of the research funders had put some best practice guidance out recently on a variety of topics, and there was nothing on this topic. So I've been in touch with them to say, I think this is a really good opportunity. This is a really important mission, and it's something that I think we need to work towards pulling some guidance together on this. And that's a conversation I'm hoping to progress with them over the next year. I think where people have relationship, there's lots of ways you can influence on this. It's not just funders. I think as peer reviewers of manuscripts, I think you can point this out, because you're flagging it to a journal editor, you're flagging it to the study author that this seems to be an omission. I think as someone who's reviewing a grant, if that's something that you're doing at the stage of the career that you're at, you can be flagging this in your reviews that are going back to grant panels. And I think it is, I'm not at a position in my career where I can ring the Wellcome Trust or NIHR and say, I really think you need to be, putting this on as a funding criteria. But I try to seed it through as many channels as I can.
Okay, we have a question from Aileen O'Carroll. She says, could you tell us what strategies you tried to support people who have to work on traumatic subjects while working in their home?
Yeah, so it's varied over different phases of, depending on how strict the lockdown has been. So when people could still, work outside the home for periods of, when cafes were up and they're not currently here, we would recommend that, people might want to, if they weren't working on something confidential, then, spend some time working outside the home if you're able to. More practically, we would think about if you're having, ideally, you wouldn't be working in your bedroom on this. If you are having to work on your bedroom on these topics, don't sit and work on your bed. Even if it's a fold away table that goes away at the end of the day, try and find a space where you can sit at something resembling a desk and do the work there. Make sure that you put everything away at the end of the day. So don't leave papers out, don't leave your laptops out, physically put it away at the end of your day, and let that be the end of it. Ideally, if you want to store, I was always one of these children who, if I read a scary book, I left it outside my door. I don't like things that disturb me in my room. So, just even move it out, physically move it out of your room if you have to. I think this thing around, finishing work on that type of material at 3 and doing something, a little bit more safe and mundane at the end of the day, if that's just responding to emails or doing something, catching up on some training towards the end of the day. So you have a separate, so the last thing in your work brain isn't the traumatizing material. I think that's really helpful. I think the loss of the commute has been really unhelpful, actually, for people being able to decompress from work. And so, I would encourage people to, physically get out, do something that resembles a commute at the end of the day. Go for a walk at 5 o'clock. And once you're done for the day, be done for the day.
Okay, if anyone has any more questions, speak now. Otherwise, we're going to move on to our next speaker. Oh, I think that is all. Okay, so thanks very much, Sian, and thanks for the questions. So we'll move on to our next speaker segment. So we have James McCormack, who is a psychotherapist and head of student counselling and wellbeing services at NUI Galway. So he has a caseload of clients and supervisees, and he also leads a team of counsellors. And James also provides training for NUI Galway staff on identifying, responding to students in distress and at risk. James is a member of the Irish Council for Psychotherapy as a psychotherapist and clinical supervisor. And in 2011, he completed an MSc entitled The Experience of People Who Stammer in a Therapy Programme Using Art. So James describes the process as being extremely triggering at times, giving his own traumatic history with stammering. And I think James will also draw on his personal experiences in this regard in his talk today. So James, take it away.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot. I feel very warm at this point. I feel very humbled to be in the presence of so many researchers in this field of trauma. Obviously, it's something that I think is really vitally important, and unless we get to a point where we have it right, then there's a risk, isn't there, that that cohort of people is going to be excluded from research, and that's definitely something that we don't want or need. So I was just going to share a little bit about my own experience. I do my master's, and I haven't haven't done research since 2011, so I'm a little bit rusty in that regard. So I just to give you a little bit of my history. I stammered very severely from the time I was a small child. My stammer would have started off as just like repetitions like mama, 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 mammy. But then as I grew a little bit older, with being ridiculed, laughed at by children and sometimes adults, what's a kid going to do? So I tried to hide it. So, but I was a person that stammers. Nobody quite understands why 1% of the population do, but there you go. But what we do know, what makes it worse is actually trying not to do it. So my stammer went from being easy repetitions like, mammy to mammy. And you can see how that's going to be, it's physically distressing, psychologically distressing, it makes it very hard to do an interview. So I went through most of my life, but I managed okay. I got married. I have two grown-up children that I'm really proud of. I started a small business at the time. So I muddled through, but it was for my 50th birthday. I decided I'd give myself a birthday present, and that was I was going to go back to speech therapy. So I went and did a program that was actually run by the HSE South, an amazing program called Free to Stutter, Free to Speak. So I went along to that program. It was a week-long intensive program, and in that program, I think for the first time, and we used conventional therapy for working with people that stammer, and they use drawing as well. Breathing, you'll have to keep an eye on my time as well, because I'm so we used drawing and art as a way to express what was going on inside us, because like speaking was difficult, and for people like me, sometimes I could be fluent, sometimes I could be very disfluent. It's hard in a group to actually maybe sometimes express what we want to say, so we used art. And during that time, for the first time in my life, I started to realize that actually this is only part of me. It wasn't all of me. It didn't have to define me. It wasn't that big a part of my identity, even though I made it such. So then I came to do my research, and I decided to do my research. I wanted to do my research on the experience of people who stammer in that program, because it was really, as you can see, it was a game changer for me, because as recently as when would I do that program? My maths aren't great, but 10-12 years ago, there's no way I would have been able to speak like this in front of a group. I remember the first time after I was asked to present my research, about 6 months after I had done it, and I had half an hour, and I said to the audience, I'm going to have 10 minutes for talking, 10 minutes for stammering, and 10 minutes for questions and answers, because that's about what it took. So I wanted to do research with the very people who I had been on that program with, and then a year later I became a facilitator on that program. So I wanted to do research with people that stammered, not only people I'd been a participant with on the program, but also now I was a facilitator on the program as well. So that brought up all kinds of ethical concerns and issues, but we got through all those. I had my supervisor, I suppose, this is one of the things, my supervisor was trained in working with people with disability. So that was the first thing. And then between her and then I went to Anne Good, she wrote the research ethics for doing research with people with disabilities in Ireland, and put the questions to her. I've been told that I can't do this research as a person that stammers and as a person that's been on the program with some of the potential participants, and she gave me some nice quotes that allowed me to proceed with that research. So I started doing the research. Actually, I'm going to share just a couple of slides, if I can share. I presume I can. Where's the share screen here? If I can find them. Okay. Yeah. So I'm not sure if you can see that. Can you see my screen there? Okay, that's a thumbs up there. Yeah, I'm not sure. It won't seem to go to the slideshow. There we go. So I proceeded with the so I suppose one of the things, the points is that I thought the research method I use is really important. So here I am. I'm going to be talking about an experience that I've had, a profound experience in. There was a lot of bullying when I was a child growing up. I was an easy target. I went to boarding school first when I was 10 until I did my leaving cert, and that wasn't easy as a person that stammered. And it was like, I described that school, it was like being in the Lord of the Flies, 365 boys who governed 365 boys, and the only times that the people in charge intervened was when we got in the way of their trajectory of whatever they wanted to do. Otherwise, we were left to our own devices. It was a very unsafe place to be, and it was very, very traumatizing. And then I, later on, like I said, job interviews, all those kinds of things. So I came to Galway to study, to come to university, and I say to people, I lived in Galway for 2 years, and my parents thought I was going to university because I didn't do a whole lot of study. I did a lot of drinking and other things to try and numb out what I was feeling on the inside. And then I dropped out 2 years in a row. Ended up, in no prospects. My father was a surgeon, uncles, aunts, all professionals. That was the expectation in our house, that you went to boarding school and you became something. But I was going to become none of this, and had a really negative impact on my life and my self-esteem. So here I am then doing this research with people that stammer, and so I was going to be interpreting people's experience of stammering, and so I chose to do IPA, interpretive phenomenological analysis, and that's what that does is it puts emphasis on the fact that it foregrounds the fact that I'm interpreting somebody else's interpretation of an experience, and that was helpful for me because I really wanted to separate. I didn't want to contaminate as much as I could what my participants were talking about and what and what was my own stuff. At the time, I was studying to become I just finished actually 4 years training as a psychotherapist. For 3 of those years, I was in personal therapy myself, so I had talked a lot about my own experiences of bullying, and I thought I had worked my way through all of it, but apparently not. So I used art. So I used IPA and art, well, it actually wasn't art, it was actually drawing. So what I did was I asked the participants to come to the interview to do some drawings of their experience of stammering was the first thing, and then their experience of having been in this particular program. And so they arrived to the interview. It seemed to me that they were in a very reflective place. So I suppose I got into very deep material very quickly. Another thing was, I thought was important was, I thinking about the supports that I had. So I had a supervisor who was trained in working with people with disability. She was a very self-aware person. I also had peers, so we used to meet every month. We would meet in a peer group of other students that were doing, they were doing research piece as well, but they were psychotherapists, so I could, talk out. I knew them very well, so I could talk out what was going on for me. That was really an important aspect. And I know Sian talked about having supports. I think that's really fundamental. And then I also journaled. I don't journal, but I journaled, and that was I think it turned out to be really important. So and the other thing I did was because I was really conscious, and I had a very explicit conversation with my supervisor, many conversations about the fact that there was a good chance that I was going to get triggered. There was a good chance that I could mix up my own interpretation of what it was like to be a person that stammered with those people. Now, I'd done loads of my own personal therapy, and I suppose I would be also suggesting that if we're going to research do research with people that have maybe had similar experiences to our own. And another point about this is that it's really common, the wounded healer phenomena, where like people that are attracted maybe psychotherapy would have had some very, their own personal difficult experiences that they've worked through, and it really helps a lot. That's why I suppose we get better with age as well, because we're humans too, and we're always experiencing life, and there's always new traumatic or difficult experiences to go through. So we had a lot of explicit conversations about this on how to, as good as we could, not have that happen, because as much and all as we might like to say that we're going to separate our ideas or interpretation from that of our research participants, we always will. That's the lens that we're going to see it through. So this made it a little bit easier to try and separate that, even though we knew that, some of it's going to get mixed in there. So I asked my supervisor to come with me to the interview because I wasn't exactly sure how it was going to go. And then I just thought from a safety perspective, and I was thinking, just as Sian was talking, that this might be something to think about. It might be helpful, and maybe that's an idea already out there. Have somebody else with you in case we do get triggered or traumatized, something like that, that the other person can pick up on it. And interestingly enough, I won't go through all my slides, but just how am I doing for time, Bridget? About probably 5 minutes over at this stage, am I? You are just over 12 minutes in. Oh, great. Yeah. So it used to be when I'd be trying to speak, people would be thinking, because I'd be so horribly stuck. I just couldn't get the words out, and people would be thinking, gosh, I wish he could I wish he could say what he wants to say, I wish he'd say something. And now it's actually the opposite. I wish he'd stop talking, because I'm so good at it. So just you see this drawing. So there was myself, and I just had, in IPA, I was doing a master, so I just had 3 research participants, and because it was a piece of like participatory action research, and so the way I recruited those people was as co-researchers. So there was 5, the way I described it, there was 5 researchers in the room together having conversation about the experience of stammering and you know, what it was like to be on the program. So we met in a boardroom in a hotel down in Middleton, I think, in Cork. That was the kind of closest point for everybody. And we started with having a cup of coffee. So we had a chat and just to help everybody relax, and then took time to go through you know, what it was about, the chance that people might find it triggering or difficult, and that we could stop at any time. Those basic kind of safety things. And also I had a list of counsellors and psychotherapists lined up for each of those people in the areas where they lived, in case that was something that they needed to avail of. What I did not have was funding to provide for that counselling if that became necessary. And I think that could be something to be designed into research, would be counselling for both the researcher and the participant if necessary, because I suppose we don't know, we can be very careful, but sometimes we might open something that the person hadn't expected. And like Sian said, you just don't know when it's going to happen, when that trigger is going to happen. So just to give you an example, when this picture up here, I'm sure if you can see my mouse, of all the drawings, actually I'll just go to the person's slides. Yeah, so like, the nice drawings, aren't they? I thought this would be nice to look at, if nothing else. And the person talked about different layers, different colors, different parts of me, the darker colors, deeper, sadder emotions, the brighter colors were happier emotions. So rather than saying to this person, to Larry, rather than saying, you know, tell me about your experience of stammering, I said to him, talk to me about your drawing, your painting. Talk about the deeper, the darker colors, talk about the brighter colors. And then, so he started talking immediately from a very kind of deep place. So I ended up getting very rich data, but he was kind of abstracting this, and he was looking at his drawing as he was talking and reflecting and thinking about it. So then, you know, these are some of the things. So, you know, I was using, you know, at the time I was doing narrative therapy. So I kind of framed some of these questions, and this is the green is the before, the red is how he felt before he'd done the program, and the green is how he had felt after he had done the program, you know. And he stammered just as severely, but just it had you can see the difference that it made for him, and you can see that, you know, how, you know, the difficulty that he had. And then this next person, Amelia, talked about her art, the darker colors, the bright colors, again, similar enough theme. And then when she talked about, you know, I asked her, and I only realized this after, when I was transcribing the recording, when she talked about, you know, I said, you know, talk to me about your drawing, talk to me about the brighter colors, now talk to me about the darker colors. And one of the things that gets me still, she talked about, so when I'm telling this story, I laugh and I cry, but I'm really okay, because I've talked about this a lot, and I'm really comfortable about all this. But she talked about days when I'd stay in bed all day and wouldn't want to speak to anyone. And it was only when I was transcribing the material, I realized for 10 minutes in that interview, I wasn't there, because I was back when I would stay in bed all day and I wouldn't want to speak to anyone. And I suppose at that point then, my supervisor noticed what had happened, and she stepped in a little bit, because when I came back to myself 10 minutes later, I asked them the same question again. I was that much gone. So then I got the data, I went to write it up, and I wasn't able to write it up. I'd started, because, you know, with IPA, what I'm doing is I'm looking at what are they saying, the language they're using, the meaning, how they would interpret their life like this. And so I started to empathize, and, you know, like, we empathize from our own life experience. That's where we do it from. So when we empathize, we're going to be touching on our kind of soft underbelly, on the delicate, so maybe some of the vulnerable parts of ourselves. And that's what happened. That was what was happening for me. So I was the only, it wasn't during the lockdown, but the only place I could find in my house where I could lay on all my pieces of paper was my bed. I had this massive, a massive big bed, and I could put all my papers out there. But that was the way I did it. But then I would actually, I would put them all away, out of the way, downstairs. I had them locked actually in a cabinet when I wasn't working on them. So that's really good advice. And I'd be there sitting in my bed, and I'd just be bawling my eyes out, because I would say to myself, I thought I'd got through all this. I thought I'd worked my way through all this, but just when those people were talking about their experiences, it triggered more memories in me. And that's the thing about traumatic memory, is we forget. One of the things about that, though, that's actually a good thing. Sometimes we say, oh yeah, that's just a negative, a bad coping mechanism. It's actually very resourceful. And if somebody is able to put stuff into forgetfulness, or to suppress it or repress it even, that's something that we could remind people of as well. Actually, you were able to keep this under wraps. That means you can do it again. We can take it out and look at it. And we often would talk like that in counselling with people. There's a safe place sometimes to take this stuff out and look at it. And sometimes it's not when you're on your own. So that's the kind of stuff that you might want to bring to counselling. So while I had stopped going to counselling at that point, and actually I had no choice, I brought myself back to counselling. And because I just needed to talk through a lot of the things that were triggering me, and just to regain a bit of a sense of who I was again, and as a researcher. So I suppose another thing I'd be thinking about is for how to design in, because that's one of some of the questions, would be to realize that possibly some researchers might need to take a time out and actually stop and maybe do some personal work, or step away from it, or do it in smaller increments. Because I know for me, when I was writing up at the end, I went way over the word count, but I was allowed, because I got away with it, because it was all kind of fresh stuff. But I would find, if I stepped away from it, and you probably know this very well, if I was away from my work for a couple of days, it would take me maybe 3 or 4 hours to get my head back around it again before I could actually start working on it again. Or maybe there's systems to get away from that, but I wasn't able to manage that days in a row to actually work on this stuff, so I'd become immersed in it. So between the personal counselling and so on, that helped me a lot. Plus I had loads of conversations with my supervisor as well. I was also, as I said, in a support group. I also had another counsellor that I spoke to every week, just to check in to see how the research was going, how their research was going. But I found all those connections with other people important. But they were all things that I had. They were all part of my psychotherapy training, the organization around that, and you wouldn't necessarily have those, and that they all have a cost. So I was just thinking, as Sian was speaking, if I can be any help to talk in, I know there was a conversation about how do we change the system, how do we get funding for funding for research such as this, and I really hear what you're saying about it's really counselling has been a female primarily dominated industry, and maybe this kind of research as well, it seems like most of the people here could be also female as well, but I think that's an important point. The discourse out there about what's research is really an important conversation to have. No, I think that our own research committee, the ethics committee, they seem to me to be quite concerned about safety, but this is all about safety for us and safety for the participants. Now I'm going to get out of here because I had some more notes that I wanted to quickly touch on.
James, we're over time, but take another.
Oh, sorry.
No, just take another few minutes if you want. That's fine. Keep going.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. I just thought about the challenges. Safety researchers, obviously vicarious trauma, the response to the participants being traumatized. I was also thinking of the anxiety in the researcher about the participants becoming traumatized or re-traumatized. So I think the research design would be really important. Informing participants of the risks and providing emotional support, like I mentioned, the wounded healers. I think expect to be triggered. If we're going to be doing this kind of work, then it could be I need to prepare myself. So I might need to do when I say personal work, I might need to actually bring myself to counselling to work through some of my own trauma if I haven't done that. I'd say to do that first, and then safety first has to come first. And then I thought about the supervisors. Eventually, when Sian and Brideen, when you have your, when all these conversations happen and there's loads of experienced people supervising work with traumatized people, then I was thinking the supervisor is like the shark. He's at the top of the food chain. And just to be, because all that condensed trauma is going to be landing with them. And the thing is, I know as a supervisor as well, that happens. There's all this really amazing research going on with like neuroception, polyvagal theory. We communicate more than with words, and sometimes stuff can land in us and we don't know what's happened till later. We're exhausted, or we wake up with our headache, we can't sleep because somebody, because stuff has landed with us, and that's why it's really important. I think the supervision that Sian mentioned as well, it's has to be there. I think, I was just one thing I thought about possibly might be interesting is to bring in a clinical supervisor in counselling and psychotherapy, because they'd have some kind of experience, maybe to look at some of the questions and the research methods as part of the design for, both the protected researcher and the participant. And like I said, have a second researcher maybe with you when you're doing the interview. That could be a useful support. And then funding. And like I said, if I could get any support around that, I'd be very happy to do that. I think I've actually mentioned some of the other better than I thought. Just the supervision, the research method, the journaling, personal therapy, support groups. I think, all really important things. So I hope I've been some help or added to the conversation in some way.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, James. All right, so if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat box. Sian has just made a comment. Just go down to it. You were saying
I'll unshare this, so it'll be better.
Okay. Sian, I think you were kind of chiming in with what James was saying about having a second interviewer in the background. And this is something you have set up more recently, is it, with COVID?
Yeah, it's something that we did primarily around trying to integrate some researchers who were less experienced researchers, trying to support them in developing their research practice, and also I think we also had concerns about what happens if the internet drops out, or what happens if the recording doesn't work, and so we kind of started also for kind of technical difficulties. But actually, I think what we have found is that there is a source of comfort that comes from there being another person there, so that interview becomes a shared experience, and also if it does become too much, that person can step out, or actually on the day if the person wakes up, and it's something that I've seen happen with some of the survivor-led work that I've been doing recently, or that I've been supporting recently, not doing myself. If on the day the person thinks, actually, I'm just not where I need to be able to do this interview safely, that person can step away from the interview, and the second interviewer can step in to do it instead. And so it really helps, I think, in maintaining that commitment to one's own well-being and respecting one's limits.
James, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I suppose that absolutely. the safety piece has to come first, and the well-being of the participants as well. But also, you know, you've worked so hard to get to where you go. You want to get good data as well. Just, I suppose, because I was a psychotherapist, I know some of the kind of research ideas will talk about that, you know, maybe I had a license to go a little bit deeper than somebody that wasn't a psychotherapist. So so it's about being attuned to the person, noticing body language, all those kinds of things. But I think that there's no mystery in that. Like, active listening is a skill that we can learn, and that might be something to maybe to practice as well in you know, in those support groups. But also to know that when we do actively listen, actually it makes a big difference, and people can go very deep, deeper than they would if somebody wasn't actively listening. So you still want to get rich data, but you need to, I suppose, be aware of when the conversation might be going a little bit too deep. And I don't know how, I'm just putting that out there. I'm not sure how to particularly safeguard against that, but I think if you have somebody, a second person there, that could go as part of the way, and maybe have make sure the questions are thought through, and thinking about the possible response or reaction of people to those questions.
Yeah, Sian, go ahead.
Thanks. I was just really interested when you're saying that you're coming at this as a psychotherapist, because one of the things we often have people in our research group who are coming from a clinical background, and they're now performing a research and not a clinical role. And I think that can be a really difficult tension to manage, actually, because when you're working with somebody clinically and you do see somebody over time and you see their trajectory and you are there in a helping role, that is very different to your researcher identity. And
Absolutely,
I think it brings up some really important issues. I wondered if that's something that had come up for you in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was me, the psychotherapist, and me, the researcher. So when I'm doing the research, I'm not trying to do psychotherapy. I'm not trying to I'm not trying to involve them in a process. I'm just asking for their personal story, and their instinct then as a therapist might be about being very clear on the questions and why I'm asking them. I think that is, yeah, absolutely vitally important. Or I suppose that's why I'm thinking possibly if there were clinicians involved in the looking at some of the questions, you know, you wouldn't inadvertently the participant. Oh, have I frozen or something?
Yeah, your connection is not great. It's a little bit in and out.
Okay, it's not great. Okay,
it's
yeah, I was wondering. I wonder had I shocked everybody.
No, it's like it's stalled. So I think
Okay.
we got most of what you said, but it was almost like you were.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Technical way.
Yeah, hopefully my facial expression wasn't too comical at that point.
I'm just going to jump in there to say that the first speaker we had in the first seminar, Professor Emerita Marie Breen-Smith, was also she was an established academic who did research in, you know, with survivors of terrorism and stuff like that, but she was also a trained psychotherapist, and someone also asked her about, you know, this idea of wearing her psychotherapist hat while doing research, and she kind of said something similar, that, you know, she absolutely wasn't a psychotherapist when she was doing research. She very much kind of entered that space. I mean, obviously you can't leave behind your knowledge and your experiences and your expertise, but that she wasn't going in there in that role, and she was very conscious of kind of separating those two roles out. I thought that was interesting that that's come up again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And then you can always just stop the conversation. And if people need to take time out, that's what we did as well. You know, at any time we can stop, anytime. I might say that let's stop for a few minutes, just take a breath, see how we are.
I'm going to ask a question for James, and it's sort of for you, Sian, as well, and it picks up on stuff that both of you said. So this idea of, you know, having the second researcher, or you, James, you talked about taking time out from the research you know, in the short term or doing it in smaller increments. And Sian, you talked about scheduling, not scheduling interviews on the end of the week and the weekend. My question relates to how I know, you know, when you're doing research on the ground and the practicalities of it. Say I've had interviews where I've done like 4 interviews back to back, like literally one after the other, because we're I suppose we're doing what they call in like hotel management, like yield management. So we're overbooking because they say, so I'd be doing research with older travelers and older ethnic nomadic travelers and older homeless people. And there just tends to be a lot of, you make arrangements and then they get cancelled within those groups just because of what they have going on in their lives. So, you know, we would book 4 interviews, especially if you're traveling to the other side of the country to do the interviews. You know, you book 4 interviews in the full knowledge that 2 or even 3 could get cancelled. So you don't really want to just schedule 1 interview for that day. And then like it turns out, so that was, and I've talked about this probably before and people are probably sick of listening to me, but that day it was just like traumatic story after traumatic story after traumatic, like all 4 people back to back, like such terrible stories. Like, and I ended up crying in the first interview with the first woman, and then I still had to go on and interview 3 people. So my question is really, I get that you have these kind of ways of dealing with things, but how do you balance that with the practicalities of trying to actually get the research done and the time limits that are put on you and the pressures that are put on you? So I don't know if either of you want to answer that.
I think it has to come from the principal investigator, really. And I think if you are making that decision and you've communicated that as an expectation, then you have to honour it. I personally wouldn't want to do more than 2 interviews in a day. I have done projects where I've travelled backwards and forwards all over the country trying to get interviews, and I was able to do that because we had a decent amount of time for recruitment, and we had enough travel budget, frankly. So I think it often does it comes down to how many people, is your research team, have you got enough people on your research team? Can you send 2 people down that day? Have you got enough money in your budget? And I think, too often research is being done, those types of costs are being quite squeezed, and it ends up putting a lot of pressure on the researchers. But I think it's happened to me that when I was doing my PhD, actually I travelled up to do, it was interviews with professionals, not interviews with people who had experience of trafficking. And I think I did 6 in a day, and I just went to bed and I never wanted to get up from sleeping. It was so exhausting, and you're not doing your best work at that point because the level of concentration you have to do a research interview is just immense. So yeah, I think it has to come from the top, really.
Yeah, I think six is a lot. But I think it is possible. But I suppose I'm at this quite a while and trading and so on. I remember I saw 3 very traumatized individuals in a row one day and walking across campus, and I was exhilarated. But that's, I suppose, because I've I know how to manage it now. But if that had been like 10 years ago, yeah, I wouldn't have been up for much after that. But it's possible, I think, with some experience, but also it's about knowing that the person is safe and that you've done good work with them. Now it's very different. This is therapeutic work. Knowing that I've done good work with the person and it's making a difference for them. That's where the exhilaration comes from. But I'm guessing it could be the same in an interview. That I've done really good work here. I've stayed grounded in myself. I've been in tune with the person throughout the interview. I've listened very well. But yeah, 4 in a row might be, I'd say it's going to be a lot.
Yeah, especially when you cry in the first one, you feel like maybe I didn't do that as well as I could have, Okay.
But that, I wouldn't be too worried about that either. Sometimes I might shed a few tears with a client. I think that's really all right,
Yeah, no, definitely. It wasn't the worst thing in the world. I think it made the woman feel like I cared, which she definitely seemed to appreciate. I mean, she was telling me just a story of very heartbreaking bereavement, multiple bereavements, and I think, you know, she was a traveller, and I think travellers just feel so marginalised in Ireland to feel that someone who wasn't a traveller really cared about the discrimination that they face and the hardship that they face. I think she appreciated it, but at the same time, you know, I wasn't there for her to comfort me, you know, that kind of thing. I don't, if anyone has any more questions, please put them in, but in the meantime, I'm going to ask James another one. James, I wonder, the methods that you chose when you were doing your research, IPA, and you're talking about using PAR, do you think your choice of those methods was in part an effort to keep your own trauma at bay and the participants' trauma at bay? You know, do you think kind of using these very participative methods, kind of quite innovative methods, do you think there was, you know, is that what part of the thinking was?
Absolutely, yeah. Because I mean, I was very aware that it was a very emotionally triggering thing for me. It was still, you know, quite raw in some ways. And like I said, I thought I had worked my way. I thought I had done all my personal work, but yeah, that was they were the main reasons for it, to try and keep me get out of my own way. Was really what I was trying to do. Get really good data, because, you know, because I have the lived experience, I know what it's like, and that can help me on one level, and it can help the participant as well at one level, but on another level it could muddy the waters seriously as well. You're muted now, please.
Sorry. Okay. So if anyone wants to add anything before we wrap up, does anyone want to say anything else? No? Okay, so I'll just finish by saying thanks again, James, and thanks, Sian. You've both been really generous in giving us your time and for contributing so well today. And I feel like we've learned a lot. So as I said, the video of the seminar, I'm just going to, you know, edit the start and the end of it, and I'll get it up online in the next few days, hopefully. And if the speakers have anything that they want me to share, whether it be resources or anything generally, or stuff that they've written themselves, we can get those up on the webpage as well. So this is the third in the seminar series. So the fourth and final seminar in the series is going to take place in 3 weeks' time on March 23rd. And if you have been attending all the seminars, you'll know that they all have so far taken place between 3 and 4:30, but just note that the final seminar is happening a little bit earlier. It's from 1 to 2:30 p.m. The speakers are going to be Dr. Nini Fang, who's a lecturer from the University of Edinburgh. And then we also have Leah Foley and Jonathan Foley, who are transcribers, and they're also owners of transcriptionshop.ie. So if you want more information on the speakers and the registration details, they're on the ICSG website now, so icsg.ie. So I'm going to put the link to that now in the chat box. So if you want to go right now to register, you can do that right now. Just give me a second to do that. There you go. It's there now. Okay, so please do join us if you can, and tell your friends about it, spread the word. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Thank you.